Every story is an experience, one we'll never forget. The nostalgia, the emotions, the chance to relive moments that shaped who we are. Today we step into the journey of Judith Perkins, a story of resilience, adventure, and lessons learned, a journey absolutely worth telling. This is Journey to Pacific, where every story comes to life. Let's get into this.
Hello, my name is Judith Perkins, and welcome to the third episode in the life of George Seavers. I wrote the book Journey to the Pacific, One Man's Quest. In this story of George and his family, and it spans the decades of his desire to see the Pacific Ocean and to taste the salty water. In the last episode, I told you about how George made his way from the orphanage in Illinois and how he took the train to Cheyenne, Wyoming, met his wife, Marie, and had 2 of his children there. After living for a time in the big city of Portland, Oregon, George and Marie decided that Portland was not where they wanted to raise their family and bought a hotel in a small town in eastern Washington called Rawlings. In the late 1800s, my great-great-grandparents had purchased a hotel in a small town in eastern Washington called Riparia. They raised their family there and developed the town into a thriving community. In the early 1960s, I was fortunate enough to be able to visit the town of Riparia with my parents and an aunt and uncle who were both born and raised in the hotel. Although just a ghost town, when I visited, I was able to see the hotel and some of the surrounding buildings. Again, in the early 2000s, my husband and I visited the area. There was nothing left of the town, only slabs of concrete where buildings used to be. The hotel was demolished and the town was partially flooded with the creation of the pool behind the Lower Monument Dam on the Snake River. Riparia is quiet now. The only sounds are those of the fish jumping to catch the flies. But it was easy to imagine my ancestors thriving in that area. The rolling hills of wheat and the cattle grazing in the fields were still testament to the family who built a town and community there. Back to the life of the Seavers. Rawlings was a small town, less than 500 people, including the outlying farmers and ranchers, when the Seavers arrived. Their main businesses consisted of the railroad and the riverboats. The hotel that George and Marie bought did not have anyone running it at the time, and the only place to get a meal was either one of the 2 taverns, one at each end of the town. When George and his family arrived in town, they found the hotel occupied by a group of ladies of the evening and several men who worked for the railroad. George had to show proof of ownership before they would leave. Marie made the children stay in the wagons and would not set foot in the building until they were all gone. George, Marie, Mary, and Jane worked hard to clean the place up and make it presentable as a hotel again. They found a supply of unused sheets and blankets that they could use. George had to repair some of the furniture in the rooms, but after a lot of scrubbing and hard work and out of carving a sign that said Seavers Hotel for the front of the building, they were able to open for business. The restaurant needed a lot of work before they would be able to open and serve meals. It was in total disrepair, and George had to build a lot of the kitchen area to be able to fix a meal. The double wood stove and ovens were in good condition though, and just needed a little scrubbing to get them ready for use. All the supplies that the Seavers brought with them from Portland would suffice for the time being. George negotiated with some of the local farmers for fresh produce, milk, and eggs. The Palouse and Nez Perce Indians lived in eastern Washington and often rode the tugboats down the Snake and Columbia rivers to the fishing area at Celilo Falls. When they noticed that the hotel was occupied, they eventually made themselves known to the Seavers family and started bringing wild game to be used in the restaurant. The permanent residents of the city were quick to introduce themselves to George and his family. They were excited about the hotel opening up and maybe having a post office again. Stephen and Jane Taylor took a trip to the county seat and were able to apply for the job of postmaster of Rawlings. Because of his accounting background, working for a bank in Portland, Stephen was hired and was able to open the post office in the hotel. Jane Taylor took over the job at the registration desk of the hotel. At first, the only clients were the employees of the railroad who had to stay over before they headed out for a run on the next day. They were pleased that for the first time in a long time, they had a clean bed to sleep in and a good meal to fill their stomachs. Marie and Jane's sister, Susan Lewis, was teaching school in Laramie and had been for several years. Her fiancé was killed and she was in deep mourning, but she was still able to teach. There was a school building in the city of Rawlings with an apartment above the schoolroom. George and Marie were concerned about their girls not being able to go to school and wrote to Susan and asked if she would come to Rawlings and open up the school again and be their teacher. Susan was very glad for the opportunity to get away from the sadness of Laramie and to be with her family again. So she packed all of her belongings and made arrangements for them to be shipped by rail to Rawlings. She then said goodbye to Laramie and headed west to Lewiston, Idaho, and then on to Rawlings. George had some work to do on the apartment above the schoolroom before Susan could move in, and Marie, Mary, and Jane got busy and cleaned the classroom to make it presentable and ready for the students. During planting at harvest time, a lot of the students were not able to go to school on a regular basis. They were needed to work on the farms and ranches, and some of the parents did not think it was necessary for their sons and daughters to have an education. They were just going to work on the farms. Why did they need to be educated? But George was a big believer in a good education for all young people. He did not have a formal education himself and was more or less self-taught, but wanted his children to have as much knowledge as they could about different things. Susan arrived in Rawlings, the school opened, and another milestone was reached for the town of Rawlings. The next thing needed in the town was a good blacksmith and livery stable. George knew that a lot of the men from the outlying farms came into town and needed a place to stable their horses. They also need the services of a good blacksmith. Most of them knew how to shoe their own horses, but it was a tedious job and something that a good blacksmith could do quickly and probably a lot better than they could. George had picked out an area just behind his own property of the hotel to build a stable and adjacent blacksmith shop. Now all he had to do was find someone to do the job. He had the telegraph operator at the railroad depot send wires to all of the large newspapers advertising for the job. It was about a month before Ray Clausen answered the ad. He came to Rawlings, liked the area, and was an experienced blacksmith. With much of his own equipment, he was able to open the shop and the livery stable, much to the delight of all of the townspeople. Another milestone was reached for the town of Rawlings. As I was writing this part of the story, I thought about my great-great-grandfather and how he must have felt being the driving force behind a growing town, and the pride he must have taken in seeing his family being accepted in the area. About this time, a young man came into town from Chicago. His name was Jeff Jordan. He had received a substantial inheritance and was looking for land to buy to establish a cattle ranch. He approached George to see what was available in the area, and George suggested that he go to the county seat and check the records there. After coming back from his inquiry trip, Jeff rode over the lands that were available and returned to the county seat to purchase 3 sections just south of town. One section amounted to 160 acres, so he had quite a bit of property there. The land needed improvement, and he would need a space to live, but there was an old cabin that could be fixed up enough to live in for the time being. Jeff had no experience as being a carpenter and asked George if he knew anyone who knew how to do carpentry work. George had just met Earl Jansen, a customer at the hotel. Earl was passing through town on his way west and was looking for work to pay for the next leg of his trip. George introduced Jeff to Earl, and an agreement was reached that Earl would help Jeff repair the cabin enough to live in comfortably until a house could be built on the property. Jeff also needed a barn, bunkhouse, and several corrals constructed in the near future if he was to put cattle and horses on his property. Earl very soon proved himself invaluable to Jeff and was hired not only as a carpenter when needed, but a ranch hand also. Earl was to become a town carpenter, being used to help out on several different building projects. Jeff was very satisfied with his purchase and soon became a valued member of the community. Since Susan Lewis had been in Rawlings with her family, she had kept pretty much to herself as far as other residents were concerned. But Jeff Jordan noticed her and began seeing her occasionally, but always in the company of one of her family members. Susan had made a commitment to her dead fiancé from Laramie that she would never love another man. After several months of seeing each other, both Jeff and Susan admitted there was an attraction between them. Susan finally came to terms with the loss of her fiancé and embraced the love she was feeling for Jeff. Jeff had a large farmhouse built on his ranch so that he and Susan would have a place to raise a family. To their sorrow, Susan lost their first child to a miscarriage. During this time, a general store and a medical clinic were added to the town. Dr. Blake Stevens was hired as the town's doctor and soon became indispensable to the town and surrounding farms and ranches. He was a young man just starting out in his practice, but was a caring and very professional doctor, taking an interest in all of his patients, young and old. During the late 1800s, women were not allowed to teach school after they were married. Susan had to quit her job and a new teacher was hired. Fiona McGregor answered the ad for the new teacher. She came to Rawlings with high hopes of building a new life in the prairie town. As the young widow, and she needed a new start in a new town, in a new area of the country. Fiona loved all of the children, but had a hard time with the idea that some of the children didn't attend school on a regular basis. She and Susan Jordan became good friends, and Susan explained to her the need for the children to work on the farms and ranches. Fiona worked hard to arrange her lesson plans to fit the students' attendance and their needs. On the farms near the city one of the farms near the city belonged to a man named Otis Kingman. Otis had a wife and 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. He was abusive to both his wife and his children, beating them when he felt they had done something wrong, whether they had or not. None of Otis's sons had gone to school. He sent his daughters to school, but not on a consistent basis. His sons were to work on the farm from sunup to sundown, with no time for any other activities and with very little food to eat. Dr. Stevens discovered Otis's youngest son, James, sitting on the clinic steps one day crying because he had fallen down and gotten dirt on his clothes. He knew his father would beat him because of it. James was only 5 years old and walked with a severe limp due to an injury caused by his father when he was a baby. Dr. Stephen took James home after cleaning him up and discovered Otis's wife, Virginia, had just had a baby boy, and he was dead, and Virginia was near death himself. She had had no food nor water, and the rest of the children had not eaten either. Otis was nowhere to be found. When he returned home, he found his wife and family gone. When he stormed into town to try and find them, he was confined to the locked room in the train station that was used as a jail, and the judge from the county seat was sent for. Otis was finally put on trial for manslaughter in the death of his baby son and for the abuse of his wife and children. He was sent to prison at the Walla Walla State Prison. His two oldest sons were sent to live with Jeff and Susan Jordan on their ranch. Susan tutored them, and they worked on the ranch. Both of them thrived living with the Jordans and became well-educated young men and valued employees. Virginia Kingman recovered from the birth of her son and had made a good life for herself working at the hotel. She sold the farm and moved into a small house in town with her daughters and two youngest sons. Unfortunately, it took time for the Kingman children to overcome the stigma of being Otis Kingman's children, and to overcome that was difficult for them, but all of them were able to prove themselves worthy of a good life. They went on to become valued members of the Rawlings community. An attraction grew between Dr. Stevens and Fiona McGregor, the new teacher, and eventually they married, and again another teacher had to be hired for the town. Fiona helped her husband at the clinic. Although not a nurse, she proved to be a caring and competent assistant for Dr. Stevens. The town of Rawlings was growing, and the people enjoyed the companionship of their fellow residents. They had town meetings, picnics, and get-togethers whenever the time and the weather allowed. The Christmas holiday was a special time for everyone in town. Every effort was made to have a celebration for all of the townspeople to attend. Even Santa arrived at that time. The hotel was always decorated, and a large tree was set up in the lobby. The children made all of the decorations, and a special time was set aside for them to decorate the tree. Life in Rawlings and for the Seamstress family was good. The children were growing and each establishing their own personalities. The hotel was doing a thriving business, and Jane Taylor, taking charge of the registration desk, helped immensely. The restaurant was always busy. George was an excellent cook and served healthy and hearty meals and enjoyed the hustle and bustle of family life. But he had never lost his burning desire to see the Pacific Ocean. He was not to give up that quest, and vowed that someday he would make it to the ocean and taste that salty water. Thank you for listening to this episode in the life of George Stevens and his family and the town of Rawlings. Please stay tuned for more in the life of George and his family. Thank you. Goodbye.